Hey friends, welcome back to our Bible study series. We're going to jump into a new book for our next study, and we are jumping into the book of Ephesians. It's a beautiful epistle that gives us a great amount of doctrine and duties for daily living. And so let's jump into some context and some information about the letter. We believe the Apostle Paul to be the writer of this letter. There is a little bit of contention within theological circles as to whether this was actually written by Paul. There is some early manuscripts that don't say it was written to the people in Ephesus, but the majority of the manuscripts do tell us that it was Paul and it was to the people in Ephesus. It's a little different than some of Paul's other writings. A lot of Paul's other writings have greetings to specific people. We don't see that as much in this letter. So there's some contention as to whether Paul really wrote it. We do believe that Paul wrote this letter. Paul lived in Ephesus for 3 years. The book of Ephesians was believed and is believed to be a circular letter. So it was a letter that was sent to the area of Ephesus, but also meant to be circulated to all the local churches. And so that would help understand why there's not as much personal information to the people, personal greetings to the people in Ephesus. We do know that this is one of Paul's prison epistles. We believe that it is written about the year 60 AD, at the beginning of Paul's imprisonment in Rome. We know Philippians comes later, about 62, where Paul has really settled into his imprisonment and doesn't believe he'll be getting out anytime soon. So Paul lived in Ephesus for 3 years. The church was established on his third missionary journey. And when Paul is in Rome about AD 60, he is in prison and he writes this letter to the people in Ephesus. And it's really a beautiful book of doctrine and duty. And in the midst of all of this, Paul ties the epistle together with worship. And so we see so much of Paul's personal prayers in the book of Ephesians, as well as his own command to worship for us as believers and his own personal worship. So you're going to see phrases in the book of Ephesians with specific context to worship. One of those phrases is to the praise of his glory. And Paul uses that phrase over and over again in this book as he commands the church and calls the church to do specific things to the praise of God's glory. We also see a lot of Pauline language that help us really understand that this was a letter written by Paul. Long phrases that are phrase upon phrase upon phrase. That's very typical of Pauline writing. We see Paul's use of words like hope, love, and faith over and over and over again. A little bit about Ephesus. In the ancient world, Ephesus was a port city. Now, you wouldn't know that today. It's in modern day Turkey, but the city of Ephesus was a major, massive port. If we want to talk about how big a city was, in the Old Testament, the city of Jericho was about 7 acres, and it held somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people. The city in Jerusalem during the time of King Solomon is estimated to be about 25,000 people. The city of Ephesus in the first century ancient world is estimated to be 250,000 people. So these God-fearers, these Greek converts, these early Christians in Ephesus, have a huge task ahead of them to proclaim the gospel and to build up churches in this massive, massive city. The focus in Ephesus, in this port city, is commerce, and they are highly indoctrinated into pagan religion and the worship of the goddess Artemis. In some Roman context, this is the goddess Diana. In the Greek context, this is Artemis. And there was a temple in the city of Ephesus that was really the highlight of the city. It was built in 550 BC, and Artemis was the goddess of fertility and childbearing. And so there's a lot of stories and mythology that come around this, but the temple of Artemis is right in Ephesus. And so that's going to frame the context for the life of these people and the pagan ways that they have worshiped. Worship in Ephesus, before somebody came to be a Christian, worship in Ephesus revolved around this pagan temple and this pagan goddess, and worship was done by sexual encounter with temple prostitutes. And so you can see how for men specifically, worship was incredibly exciting because it involved sex with prostitutes. And for women, they would go to this temple and offer sacrifices really in a desire to bear children or to have an easy childbearing experience. And so this fertility goddess, she's not a new concept. We see this in ancient Egyptian history with Asherah. And really, it breaks down a lot of the context for what we're going to study in the book of Ephesus. And so we're going to see Paul reframe worship for us as Christians, as God-fearing believers, as well as talking about evangelism and going out with the gospel. And so I hope that helps frame the reference as we jump into this beautiful letter.